Well, good morning. And welcome to worship at St. Matthew's United Church and Bloor Street United Church. We move now to the acknowledgement of traditional territory. And I really like the acknowledgement of traditional territory that is used by the 519 Community Center on Church Street, and so I'm using that one. We are located in Takaranto, now known as Toronto, which in Mohawk means where there are trees standing in the water. Today, Takaranto is covered under Treaty Number 13 and the Williams Treaties. It is the traditional territories of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As we gather here today, these nations continue to experience ongoing colonization and displacement, where land acknowledgements are offered in place of land itself. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty made between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. As settlers, newcomers, refugees, and indigenous peoples, we all have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We are also mindful of broken treaties that persist across Turtle Island today and recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in a meaningful, continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all our relations. It is in the hope that someday there will be reconciliation following on the heels of truth-telling, and that the treaties will truly be honored. And as we hold that hope, we light the Christ candle to acknowledge the presence of Jesus the Christ, an indigenous person who lived through colonization of his land by a foreign power. I'm going to invite you to rise as you are able, in body or in spirit, and to read responsively with me the call to worship. We come to worship with many stories of violence and despair weighing on our hearts. May we look to the Holy Spirit when we feel helpless, when we do not know what to pray, when words fail to contain the groaning of lament. May we not harden our hearts to the cries of victims. May we remember that peace, to be restorative, must be rooted in truth and built on justice, while also embracing the way of love. May we not ignore the necessary foundation of human rights, that we are all made in the image of God. May we May May we acknowledge the painful complexity of forgiveness and reconciliation. May we hold space not merely for sorrow, but also hope and peace that transcend the sum of present circumstances.
Good morning, everyone. The scripture reading today is from Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22, and verses 34 to 40. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you're sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these commandments hang all the laws and the prophets."
So as the choir settles in, I'm going to tell you why we don't have an anthem. This is stewardship season for our congregations, and I was going to preach on stewardship today, and I thought that passage about render unto Caesar and the coin was perfect, and then everything in the Middle East blew up. And so I've shifted gears, and the performance piece that Mikey had worked up, which was the Pink Floyd song, "Money, It's a Drag," just seemed a little bit too cheeky for this service. And so it's firmly rooted in Mikey's back pocket to be pulled out at some point when we're free to be a little more cheeky. So now you know what I'm going to be attending to in today's sermon. I think everybody in the room knows what's been happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip. And I want to start by telling a couple of little anecdotes. The first is that yesterday I went to the service for City Shul, Bloor Street's partner synagogue. By the way, there was a bar mitzvah as part of the service, and it lasted 2.5 hours, which is my way of saying, please do not complain about the length of this sermon afterwards today. But there was this heartbreaking moment in the middle of the service when a young woman stood up to talk, and she's from Israel. And she volunteered to do something which I hadn't known about, but apparently within Israel and within the synagogues, there is a program where you can, if you're a young adult, you can sign up and volunteer to work for, do service with Jewish communities elsewhere in the world. And she's here for, I think, a year with City Shul. So she's from Israel. She said on the 7th of October, she woke up as her phone blew up. Hundreds of messages as the Hamas terrorists broke across the border, murdering civilians indiscriminately, kidnapping civilians, and carrying out other horrific acts. And in the subsequent days and hours, her phone kept producing messages naming people that she had known personally and her family knew personally who were killed or kidnapped. And she said, I don't know whether I want to be here or I want to be back there, because I think I'm needed back there, but I also know that with the invasion of Gaza, the lives of Jews throughout the world are now at greater risk. And indeed, as I went into City Shul yesterday, there were 2 security guards, one out front and one at the door. We don't know what that feels like, to have security guards at our door in order to worship. Some Christians do. I've visited Christians in Lebanon who do. Matter of fact, with Kalashnikovs. The other thing that struck me in that service was that all the people who spoke, including Rabbi Elise, condemned the violence of Hamas. She spoke to the powerful irony of the Hebrew word that's used in some of the Hebrew scriptures that we translate as violence. Do you know what the word is? Hamas. Which is not where that organization gets its name, but what a tragic irony. They condemned Hamas. They condemned the action. But when they prayed for the end of hate. And they were very clear. They said, God, we do not want you to destroy the haters. We want you to remove the hate. What a beautiful drawing of a line between those things. Even in this moment of anguish and, of course, rage, in a place of worship, they held true to a vision of peace for everyone. And they said over and over again, we're praying for all innocent victims and all in danger. Then later yesterday, I was walking near the site of the rally in support of Palestinians, in support of Gaza that took place. It was a march that started at the U.S. Embassy and moved on. And I came across 2 young men carrying a Palestinian flag who appeared to be walking back to the part of the city where Virginia and I live. And so I just asked them if I could walk with them and talk to them. And again, terrible stories. One of the young men said, I have family in Gaza. The mother works in Israel. And she was on that side of the border when the attack happened and the border was sealed. Her children are in Gaza and have had to flee their homes, and nobody knows where they are. Can you imagine that mother being caught inside the nation whose army is attacking the place where you live, and your children are on the other side of the line and you have no knowledge of where they are? And then they pointed out to me that what I learned from Rabbi Abdullah Yusri, a friend of mine Imam Abdullah Yusri, a friend of mine who's the senior imam at the big mosque in Halifax, what he had been posting, which is that the oldest church in Gaza, an Orthodox church was bombed the day before yesterday, and hundreds of people have died and hundreds more are missing. And Christians amongst those in Gaza had hidden in that church seeking refuge. And these two young Palestinian men did not turn to hate in their conversation with me. They spoke of their lament and of their pain. And at the end, we shook hands, we greeted each other with an assalamu alaikum and the touching of our hearts, and we went our different ways. Now, the emotional quality of both of those encounters reminded me of my experience of the antithesis of this in both Israel, the West Bank, and in Lebanon when I was there a few years ago. So more anecdotes. When I was a student minister, I was invited to join one of these church groups that went on a Israeli government-sponsored tours of the Holy Land. And when I was there, one of the days we went into the West Bank to Bethlehem. And we went to this big, among other places, like we visited churches and holy sites, but we did stop in this one place, which was a big store, where you can buy souvenirs, specifically designed for Western Christians who are on these tours. A lot of stuff made of olive wood. You could buy these little crosses that they would tell you was made from the cross on which Jesus was crucified, right? I've been told, and enough of those have been sold to build a Brooklyn Bridge out of wood. And you could buy these lovely olive wood nativity scenes. Now, being young and being mischievous and being me, I walked through this store, and without invitation, I opened the doors at the back to the workshop, and I walked in to talk to the workers who were making this stuff. They were Palestinian Muslims. And there was one who knew enough English to translate. And so I sat down with the workers and I started to talk about Israel-Palestine. This was 1988. Does anybody remember the first Intifada? This was during that Intifada. It was a terrible time. And so they were reluctant to talk, and then one old man started to speak in Arabic forcefully. And then I looked at the translator, and he was reluctant to translate, but finally he said, the old man says, the only leader he has any respect for is Ayatollah Khomeini, because he still wants to drive all the Jews into the sea. Hate. And at that moment, my head blew up. Because that was the moment when I realized this is so complex, I may never fully understand it. You had Israeli government tour buses bringing Christians to a shop in which wares made by Muslim Palestinians, some of whom hated the Israeli government but needed the money, were crafting their wares. And at that point, there was a conflation of religion and politics that was revealed to me in a way that I have never been able to accept simplistic truths about the Middle East ever since. And then we left that shop and we were driving out of Bethlehem, and I was sitting on the bus when the window beside my head went and I was just kind of covered with that glass, bus window, that glass that it doesn't make shards, it breaks into little pieces that don't cut you. And everything changed fast. The bus halted. The tour guide stood up and shouted, "Where did they go? Where did they go?" Two teenagers who were sons of the other minister who was on this trip stood up and started to point to a house where two young men who were throwing rocks had fled. And others who knew more than me on the bus were standing up saying, "Shut up, don't tell them, don't tell them." And then quickly, our bus took off to a military outpost, was followed by jeeps full of soldiers who rushed into the house in which the 12-year-old, 11-year-old boys had fled. I asked later that evening in Jerusalem, as I sat in a bar talking to someone who'd served the IDF, what would happen to those boys. He wouldn't have given me a straight answer. He just said it wasn't good, depending on how old they are. Looking back all these years later, what juxtapositions itself for me is the emotional currency of hate in that workshop and in that episode with the IDF soldiers and the boys, and the emotional currency of lament and hope and open-hearted grace that I experienced amongst both Jews and Palestinians yesterday. And therein lies the fault line of faith, I believe. What happens with our lament? Because the temptation to move to hate is so great. Anybody who was a commissioner to General Counsel the last time and who witnessed the ugly episodes that happened on mics and cameras, because it was a Zoom General Counsel, when Jewish leaders were speaking to the United Church's discussions around Israel-Palestine, knows that the lament within United Church people, especially those who support Palestine, does alchemize into hate on occasion. And that is the great temptation for us. When I am in the Middle East, I always feel as though I'm walking through a three-dimensional game of chess. Anybody old enough to remember the original Star Trek? Come on. What did Spock play? Three-dimensional chess. You have to play it like a hologram. And it's really hard to understand and to know what your next move is. I had this sense over and over again in Lebanon. There's this game being played out between Israel and Palestine, or between Israel and Hezbollah. But behind Hezbollah is the nation of Iran. And behind Israel is the United States. And then behind Sunni Palestinians is Saudi Arabia. And if you extend the line from Iran to its imperial sponsors, you go directly to Russia. And so what we are in is a game that can very easily look two-dimensional. It did on October the 7th. It does now as the towers fall in Palestine, but you have to move to the third dimension. And for those of you who study physics, once you introduce the dimension of time into the three dimensions of space, now we're in four-dimensional chess. And you trace the historical lines all the way back to the Holocaust. And the ghosts of the Holocaust and our abandoning of Jews are part of the four-dimensional game of chess. And you trace them back to the Nakba, the disaster, the removal of Palestinians from the land in 1948. And now we're in a four-dimensional game of chess. So how the hell do we know what to do? Well, when you ask that question, Jesus is always a good place to turn. So, we have this story of Jesus being confronted by the Pharisees, and they ask him, should we pay tax to the emperor? First of all, let's trace the fourth dimension of time back to this story. Because in the New Testament, you find this sort of vilification of Pharisees. They weren't the bad guys. The Pharisees were doing the same thing that Jesus was trying to do, which is to figure out how to live with faith and honor under the thumb of an empire. But in subsequent decades, the decades in which these stories were written, Pharisaic Judaism and early Christianity were in a debate with each other. A mutual vilification was happening, and so these stories get written with the Pharisees being depicted as bad guys. Let's remember that. Well, actually, one more thing. You can already see there the emotional currency of hate being injected into the religions of the Middle East. Right in our scriptures, it's already happening. Jesus says, give me a coin. So they give him a coin, and on the coin, he says, who's on the coin, and what's the inscription? So he looks, and it's the head of Caesar. And the inscription says, Caesar God. This may be one of the most misused passages in all of Scripture. It's been used to justify the separation of church and state, which really isn't such a bad thing anyway, and lots of other things. But what's Jesus doing in this moment? When he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's, he's saying, Caesar is not God. See, in the empire that was oppressing the Israelites, there was a conflation of the emperor and God. There was divine sanctification of imperial rule. And what's the emotional currency of imperial rule? Hate. Anybody who would travel into Jerusalem for Passover and see hundreds of Jews crucified on the road into Jerusalem as a way of saying, don't mess around when you come in here, because this is what's going to happen to you. When anybody who watched the wedge politics of ancient Rome, anybody who saw how the theology of ancient Rome belittled conquered peoples so they could be oppressed and killed, understands that the emotional currency of empire is hate. And Jesus is breaking that connection. He's rejecting a religion of hate. He's rejecting a religion of conquest and the theological justification of conquest, and he is rejecting the economics that go with it, which is what I was getting at in the children's time. There's always an economics that goes with it. And that's what we're called to do, friends. You know that after the attacks on Israel by Hamas, the Israeli flag was projected on the Peace Tower in Ottawa. And there's been a lot of criticism for that. I don't want to criticize it. I just want the Palestinian flag to be projected on the Peace Tower in Ottawa as well. And then I would love to see them projected side by side. We have this feeling that if we show empathy for one people, we're rejecting the other. That's Caesar's religion. There's another way. And the other way was almost perfectly expressed by the Craddock lecturer from 2012. For those of you at St. Matt's, you don't know this, but Bloor Street has had this lecture series that's gone on for decades. And in 2012, the speaker was a Palestinian man named Izzeldin Abuleish, Dr. Izzeldin Abuleish. He wrote that book, I Shall Not Hate. He's the man, the Palestinian man whose wife died of sickness, and then his daughters, some of his children were killed by a bomb from an Israeli tank, and he migrated to Toronto. And his book is called I Shall Not Hate. And let me finish with his words. I've come to speak with open heart and mind and eyes to share with you, because in our life, this world, these days, more than any other time before in our life, we face hardships, ups and downs, tragedies, but most importantly, we want to discover ways to be able to learn and find kindness inside ourselves for a bitter world. This is a man whose children died at the hand of Israelis. And what is he saying? Find kindness. We need to learn and to practice to challenge ourselves, not to challenge others, to work for a just world. Somebody, a lectionary, told me this week that he told this story, or he writes this story outside of the Craddock lectionary, that when he moved to Toronto, he stayed in a house that had a yard with a fence behind it, and on the other side of the fence were Jews. And when they met each other, the Jews put a gate in the house, in the fence, so their children could play together. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Leave the hate to the imperialists. But what does render unto God mean? Build the gate. What's God's emotional currency? Love. The emotional currency of our religion is this one. It's cruciform. The 3-4-dimensional game of chess can become so complex that we don't know what to do next. And so we're frozen. We don't know our next move. That's our next move, is feel the hurt of everybody, lament, and then walk into the world building a gate. The Toronto Board of Rabbis sent out a letter 2 weeks ago saying, where are you? We've circled mosques in protective circles when Muslims have been attacked. Where are you? When I read that, I knew I had to go to a synagogue yesterday. Feel the lament. We will not figure out our next move here in a 4-dimensional game of chess, but in the heart and with our feet, the next move is always the same. Feel the hurt and walk out into the world to find others who are hurting, and with our bodies and our ears, just to quote somebody who preached last Sunday, show up. Just show up. They don't need us to get it right in our thinking. They don't need General Counsel to design the best remits with global pronouncements. They need us to just show up, heartbroken and cruciform. Well, that turned out to be a long sermon, friends. So let's wrap it up and let's move on. Friends, you're going to go out into this world, and every day you're going to stumble over the economics and the politics and the theology of empire. Our whole society and our world is seeded with it. But you have an alternative. You are part of a faith tradition that gives us the medicine and gives us of communities of solidarity in response. So go to the world, and when you feel those pain points, remember to breathe, remember God is with you, and remember to turn towards love. And as you go, may God bless you and keep you. May she make her face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May they lift up their countenance before you and give you peace. Go in peace. Amen.